I knew I was in trouble when I found out that I was going to follow Steve Wayne this morning. I didn't know how bad it was going to be when I then discovered that it's gotten worse. I now have to follow Austin and Brian and their very insightful comments. Nonetheless, I will forge ahead, and I'm going to try to make a somewhat broader set of comments ranging from domestic policy to national security policy, economic policy, but trying to drill a little bit deeper into the executive office of the president and the White House staff itself. I want to start, though, by observing that, at least for me, legacy is a term that I think is fraught with peril. It's especially difficult when we're trying to apply it to a presidency that still has at least a month left to go in office. It also raises all sorts of concerns and questions. What are the bases for making decisions about a president's legacy? Who gets to apply those criteria? On what available knowledge and understanding are those decisions made? And even finally, what is it we mean when we talk about presidential legacy? It seems to me that we might see a president's legacy as reflecting the significant changes and impacts that took place during an administration. We might want to say further that the president or the presidency should be directly involved in initiating or shaping some of those changes or initiations rather than simply reacting to things. Finally, it seems to me that a legacy needs to have some degree of durability. That is, it needs to last for some period of time after a president and their administration has left office. As a result, then, I find Burt Rockman's metaphor when looking at issues of presidential legacy of a footprint to perhaps be somewhat more useful. Now, with all due apologies to Hallmark and others, it seems to me that a president can be seen as establishing footprints of their own. We may want to mention, for example, No Child Left Behind, the federal response to Katrina, perhaps on the more negative end. Presidents also may, as Brian simply pointed out just very recently now, presidents also can trod in the footprints of their predecessors. Sometimes in doing so, they will deepen and perhaps move in a different direction that their predecessors' footprints started them off as. We perhaps can see that with the current president and his extension of the unitary executive theory from its roots in the Meese Justice Department under Ronald Reagan. Perhaps we can see it too in many of the administrative presidency strategies of trying to achieve policy goals through executive branch actions rather than through Congress that we also have seen in this administration. Strategies that took root, for example, in what Richard Nathan called the plot that failed in the Nixon administration and has continued through Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. At the same time, presidential footprints, we should remember, can sometimes be washed away. Steve Wayne reminded us that President Obama may well come into office and do something similar to what Vice President Cheney did in the early days of the Bush transition. Go to the Federal Register and stop the presses. Don't allow any of the executive orders or executive rules that are about to be published themselves. Many things that presidents do can be overturned by their successors. The footprints vanish, if you will. Now, these kinds of musings, then, will be a recurring theme through my comments today. And I'm going to focus on, as I said a minute ago, on President Bush's White House and executive office, staff organization, and operations. I'll be focusing, if you will, on what I like to call, as an organization theorist, organization policy. Dave Lewis says that really isn't very sexy to talk about, and yet that's where the decisions get made. That's how we figure out whether what presidents say rhetorically, what happens to it on the ground and in the field, if you will. My emphasis is going to be on continuity and discontinuity. The continuities in the Bush administration with his predecessors, and maybe some discontinuities as well, as both Andrew and Scott brought to our attention this morning. What I want to do then is to discuss three core tasks that all White Houses must perform. First, they must maintain orderly processes of consultation and decision-making, or at least try to maintain those orderly processes. Secondly, they need to develop and to oversee policy. And third and finally, presidencies are involved in presenting the president to the public. And that raises a whole range of issues that have to do with public relations and public presentation. Starting with presidential decision-making and consultation, it seemed to me from the very beginning, much as Professor Wayne said, that the Bush administration had close to a seamless transition, which was a relief to anybody who remembers back to the early days of the Clinton administration. At the outset, the structures and processes were designed by veterans of past administrations, and they generally conformed to what some of us have called, with apologies to our friends in the natural and physical sciences, a standard model of White House organization. That includes inclusive decision processes that are carefully managed, with specialized structures for policy, for outreach, and for management of the White House organization. Those White House structures then are led by experienced chiefs of staff in this standard model. We saw much of that and continue to see much of that in the George W. Bush administration. And in many ways in this administration, especially at first, the system worked as it was anticipated to work. Andy Card had a great deal of experience having served as Deputy Chief of Staff under George W. Bush's father, H.W. Bush. His replacement, Joshua Bolten, also had experience as Deputy Chief of Staff and then later as Director of Office of Management and Budget. These were experienced men who did their best to oversee what was going on in the White House office. And in many ways, again, the system worked as was anticipated. From the outset, the Bush White House was notable in its discipline, its focus, and its clear effectiveness at achieving some short-term policy goals. Now we know even from the start, long before 9/11, that there were some concerns about the opaqueness of the Bush White House. Remember, for example, the famous Dick Cheney Energy Task Force, where finally the GAO had to go to court to get records of who it was that Vice President Cheney met with during those discussions. We've never seen a full copy of those records, we need to remember. Then came crises, which happen in all administrations, as Professor Wayne reminded us. We began with the 9/11 attacks, we continue through the Iraq War, and then comes Hurricane Katrina. And it seems to be culminating now in the meltdown of the mortgage market and the Wall Street investment banks in 2008, and now the difficulties that the auto companies are experiencing. Under these kinds of circumstances, it seems to me that the carefully managed decision processes in the White House tended to break down. Picking up on a theme that Professor Wayne talked about earlier this morning. That is, there are some issues with regard to the agility and the flexibility, the adaptability, if you will, of members of this administration. When things go as planned, when they can work in disciplined ways, they work very well. When events change things, when conditions change, adaptability is somewhat difficult to restore in the White House. Let me give you just two quick examples. Sometimes under these changed conditions, under crisis situations, what we see, I think, is a free-for-all, if you will, in which powerful insiders, Vice President Cheney, Secretary Rumsfeld, Secretary Paulson more recently, have played roles as policy entrepreneurs and indeed capture the initiative as to what is to be done. The bailout plan, various kinds of warrantless wiretapping when it comes to the Vice President's office, and a range of other possible examples we can talk about later. We do have some fairly strong evidence of decision flaws and difficulties in the approach to decision making that took place in the White House. There was a lack of, if you will, process rationality, for example. That is the willingness to take a variety of different kinds of views from diverse perspectives and orient them toward finally making a decision, neither too soon in the process nor too late in the process. We have some evidence that the decisions in this administration worked well in the process leading up to going to war with Afghanistan. Procedures broke down in the process leading to war in Iraq, or at least so the fragments of evidence that we've been able to collect turn out. Under those conditions, going to Iraq, for example, there seems to be some evidence of exclusion and marginalization of key cabinet members, of key members of the White House staff.